Pleasure to have Katrin here to speak to us. She's been closely associated with the society for a long time, though not that often present. Membership secretary. Membership secretary for some time. It is nice to see her back in the fold, so to speak. She is a woman of great substance, scholar. Looking at her record, things I didn't know about. That's the thing about being among bright young people, but suddenly you realize that built up an enormous career when you haven't noticed all the details. So to take it from the beginning, a lot of Klopstock. She's very much a Klopstock lady, so to speak. The title is a compliment. So there are several major publications. I think the first one, the Rhetoric and the Origins of Free Verse, must have been originally her thesis, and then Klopstock antagonist depict, together with Kevin. Sammlung Metzler volume, Wort und Schrift, das Werk von, etc., with Kevin Hilliard again. And then several contributions to centenary volumes on Klopstock and the Klopstock handbook. It's always nice to end up in that land in the handbook.
One contribution to it.
Oh dear, never mind. It says here. And then Rilke creeps in at a later stage, as you'll have seen from the title of the Seedings paper. But there are also more general things on metaphor. So you go through work on authors and arrive at essentials of the literary modes of communication. And then research projects include work on multilingualism, on translation, and also, inevitably, now on Kafka, who in Oxford is not thinking about Kafka apart from me. Most notably, a major achievement, which would be a major achievement even without all the scholarship, is the system that she set up of what is called the Oxford German Olympiad, which is a competition every year for schools across the country, starting off in local schools, to do program of German with tests and prizes and ceremony every year at the podium to mark the awarding of prizes. And that's given German an enormous presence in schools, and the numbers of people participating are really very encouraging. And in some ways that fits in with our interests as a society, because there's always a problem for societies to acquire members, and to acquire members is necessary precondition is that they're interested in German. Interesting people in German is a very hard task these days against all the odds politically, that they've still not converted the politicians to recognizing that languages are necessary and German's necessary in any, and then more so. So that's been a great success, and is going from strength to strength. And alongside that, just sort of saw me telling she has a proof of Jesus, and does that with great energy and efficiency and pleasure. But there we are, we've got the scholarly bit this evening, and Goethe crept in alongside Klopstock and Rilke. So we have got a nice, generous mixture. And so, as they say, something there for everybody. Katrin.
I should perhaps start. It's very lovely to see so many of you here. Thank you very much. At this not very pleasant time of year to issue forth. I should perhaps warn you that the slides don't appear to be entirely easy to negotiate. So there may be some issues about going backwards and forwards that don't quite work because of batteries not being quite charged up and technical challenges. So if things don't seem to be quite as organized as they should be, that's nothing to do with the chaotic nature of my notes. It is all to do with the slides. I'd like to start off by just, partly following on from what Jim said, that my paper grows out of a research interest that goes right back to my doctoral project at Westfield College, London, which started off as focusing on the poetic tradition inspired and sustained by Klopstock. And indeed my two examiners, internal and external, Our sort of Kevin Hilliard was the external at that time, and Martin Swales the internal. And it's a topic to which Jeremy Ardler introduced me, who obviously has also got a presence in this society. And as I discovered when consulting his father, Hagi Adler's Nachlass in Marbach, in the context of editing his extensive poetic oeuvre, my project I noticed and discovered that my project had extensive roots in pre-war Prague, having ultimately been inspired really by Hagi Adler. And I'd therefore like to dedicate my paper both to Hagi Adler and to Jeremy Adler with gratitude. My topic then today is Dialogue Beyond Death, Epic Endings in Klopstock's Der Messias, Goethe's Faust and Rilke's Duineser Elegien. Of the three works at the centre of my paper, only one is obviously in the tradition of the epic, Klopstock's Der Messias. It's a remarkably long work in the grand style, consisting of 20 cantos with some 20,000 hexameters. So there are famously probably very few people who've made it right the way through. And I have to confess that I haven't read every line with full attention. And it's longer even than the Iliad or the Odyssey. The grandeur and metrical form also situated in the Homeric tradition, while the author seeks to outdo the heathen founder of the classical epic by following in Milton's footsteps and selecting a Christian subject. In this dialogue conducted through time for different audiences, the later work is shaped simultaneously by the poet's concern to situate it in an illustrious tradition, reaching back into the past, and by his endeavour to surpass his predecessors in an ambitious landmark work for a new age. The work is the outcome of an intense and active engagement with the tradition, a process that in turn shapes the audience's or reader's responses as they become aware of shifts in emphasis that generate new interpretations and thereby, in a sense, get drawn into the dialogue. My extension of the concept of the epic to Goethe's two-part tragedy, Faust, and Rilke's most ambitious poetic work, the Duineser Elegies, is obviously controversial. It's prompted by the epic scope of these works, their exceptional status within the respective poet's oeuvre, and the fact that in both cases we can trace a deep and meaningful connection with Klopstock's epic within the process of composition. This is then notwithstanding the immediately obvious differences of genre. The connection is in both cases multifaceted, concerning the choice of genre and form, and also the metaphysical subject matter and argument. Goethe competes with his predecessor's epic by creating a tragedy of epic length and cosmic reach that focuses on a human protagonist of superhuman stature. The elegiac speaker in Rilke's most ambitious work responds to the voice in Klopstock's epic, positioning his own voice in relation to the cosmic angels, in an argument that is comprehensive in its concern with the human condition in its metaphysical context. Through these three works, we can also trace the significant role of the classical tradition as a shaping force in German literature. While I shall in each case consider the significance of the work's beginning, my focus will be on the endings, for they are all remarkable in providing an extended evocation of metaphysical meaning that gains significance from all that has gone before and follows the protagonist as he crosses the boundary from the mortal world into a world beyond death. In each case, we're talking about male poets and male protagonists, so I won't bother with neutral pronouns. And in each case, I will only really be touching on a few facets of these very large topics. In this, the conclusions differ markedly from those of the epic that shaped the origin, or the epics that shaped the origin of the tradition. Their conclusions tend to be shorter and remain in the world of the action. In the Iliad, the final line focuses on the burial of Hector, marking the outcome of Achilles' destructive wrath, which forms the focus of the epic, announced in the first line. In the Odyssey, strife rages until shortly before the end, as Odysseus dispatches Penelope's suitors, with only the final lines showing Odysseus gladly accepting Athena's exhortation to desist from violence. In Virgil's Aeneid, by contrast, the hero Aeneas briefly hesitates, but then proceeds to slay his antagonist, mirroring the contest between Achilles and Hector and preparing the way for the fulfillment of his destiny to found Rome, as the spirit of Aeneas, his antagonist Turnus, flees into the gloom below. In these epics, the endings bring a sense of closure, but they can seem abrupt to modern audiences and readers. By contrast, the works considered here by Klopstock, Goethe and Rilke are all remarkable for extended endings, but prompt interpretation of meanings that transcend the mortal action. By contrast with the great classical epics of antiquity, which end with the deaths of the hero's antagonists, the endings of these three works extend beyond the finality of death. Like Klopstock, Goethe takes his protagonist up a vertical cosmic trajectory, accompanied by the celebrations of celestial choruses. Rilke, by contrast, depicts the journey of an unnamed youth through a mythical landscape imbued with symbols of death, into which the youth eventually merges in silence. The ending of Klopstock's religious epic marks the culmination of God's redemptive act, while Goethe and Rilke conclude their more secular works with brief poetic codas that articulate timeless maxims. All three works are metrically complex and exploit the expressive potential of the metric form meaningfully in the concluding parts especially. The differences between the three projects are, however, as important as the correspondences in shaping a distinctive tradition that draws energy from its dialogic complexity. Klopstock takes his audience up a vertical cosmic trajectory populated by angels and the souls of those who have risen from the dead, who accompany the Son of God as he journeys up to take his designated seat by the right side of God Father. Goethe concludes his work with a similar cosmic upward movement for his superhumanly human protagonist, but focuses on the redemptive power of das Ewig-Weibliche, while drawing on the Catholic tradition with its more concrete symbolism. Rilke opens up a richly symbolic horizontal landscape in the final elegy and includes a nameless, featureless youth who has none of the grandeur of Klopstock's and Goethe's heroes. His ending is modest and grounded in the natural world, celebrating the fertility of downward movement. Klopstock's ambition to write an epic was already conceived when he was 17, and it formed the subject of his Latin valedictory speech, Enschuld Forta, in 1745. His speech is devoted to a review of epic poets, while announcing his own intention of entering into competition with the greatest poets who have contributed to the genre, and his project of surpassing even Milton by means of his choice of subject. The syllabus at this humanist Fürstenschule consisted of studying Latin and to a lesser extent Greek, classical texts, and the Bible, which pupils read in the original Greek and Latin and in Luther's German translation. Homer and Virgil were studied in the original, and translating and writing Latin poetry, as well as learning it off by heart, formed a key part of education in the art of rhetoric. German literature was not part of the syllabus, but a fellow pupil reports that Klopstock wrote German poetry during his time at the school, and we may surmise from his valedictory speech that the status and future of German literature, focused on emulating the classical tradition, formed a significant topic of conversation amongst the pupils. It's also worth saying that these Fürstenschulen were very important in, as it were, generating poets. Context for Klopstock's conception and realization of his epic was significant in that it imbued his project with a lifelong single-minded ambition to emulate the literary masters of antiquity and compete with the most illustrious epic poets writing in modern vernacular languages as well. It inspired his choice of subject and sustained a lifelong endeavor to refine the literary qualities and poetic potential of the German language so that it would compete successfully with the languages that had attained more refined status, notably Italian, French, and English. This spirit of emulatio gained traction in his response to John Milton's Paradise Lost, which Klopstock encountered in the form of Johann Jakob Bultmann's prose translation in 1742. Having considered composing an epic focused on a national hero and initially decided on Heinrich der Vogler, deemed to be the first king of the Germans in medieval times, he was now inspired to attempt an even greater subject than Milton's, not the creation of mankind and the fall, but the redeeming role of the Messiah in his passion and resurrection. This united Klopstock's Christian commitment with his poetic aspirations in a mutually enhancing symbiosis of content and form. Klopstock's valedictory speech is woven from classical commonplaces, conveying processes and benefits of emulation, evoking a poetic genealogy that is grounded in classical antiquity and propelled by a spirit of individual and collective competition, while also being informed by a hierarchy of subjects determined by Christian precepts. Homer fulfills the role of inventor and perfecter of the genre, embodying nature itself and providing Virgil with a uniquely worthy model. So I quote, Die Natur war Homer und Homer war die Natur. Homer also ist jenes große und reiche Genie, das mit Hilfe der Natur mit dem höchsten Urbilde dichterischer Vollkommenheit in seiner Seele das Heldengedicht nicht allein erfunden, sondern es auch nach diesem schönsten Urbilde so glücklich vollendet hat. Er war es also allein wert, dass ihn Vergil nachahmte. I should say this is a translation by Karl Friedrich Kramer, published in 1780. The speech itself was produced in Latin and not published as a major work of Klopstock's or at all, I believe, until Kramer publicized it. So what I'm interested in here is not so much discussing bits of text that made it into the public domain as giving a sense of the kind of topoi that were in circulation and that Klopstock sought to put into practice in his poetry. While these two paragons from antiquity retain an unsurpassed status with regard to poetic qualities, however, they can be trumped in religious terms and consequently by their power to move the reader. And I'll again give you the German translation. Diese werden sicher des Untergangs bleiben. Auf diese werden die Dichter, die etwas Großes wagen, blicken. Diesen sollen, weil sie nicht überwunden und übertroffen werden können, die Tränen meiner Wetteiferung beständig fließen. Aber nur eins war's, das eurer Vollkommenheit noch fehlte. Religion der Heiden verblendete euch. Following Tasso's Gerusalemme Liberata, Milton had succeeded with an epic that engaged the emotions with the supremely moving plight of Adam and Eve. And Klopstock predicts that his fame will endure and grow over time. Miltons Ruhm wird, solange Menschen sind, mit den fortströmenden Jahrhunderten immer größer und überschwänglicher werden. Einen solchen Schauplatz von Dingen hatte vor ihm noch niemand gewagt, mit dem Liede zu betreten. Denn sehet, Gott, der Himmel, die Hölle, das Chaos, die Reihe so vieler Welten, die daraus hervorgegangen. Mit dem Homer streitet er um den Vorzug der Vortrefflichkeit. Um den hohen Spuren der heiligen Schriftsteller folgt er zitternd von ferne nach. I've highlighted the sort of key terms that come up in correspondence and in other literature around that time. It is notable that Klopstock here includes the holy writers of the Bible in the tradition. They are the ultimate originators of great literature. He uses the platform of his valedictory speech to announce that he will go one better than Milton, with the even greater subject of the Messias. Du aber, geheiligter Schatten des Miltons, zürne nicht über meine Kühnheit, die nicht allein dir zu folgen, sondern sich auch an einen noch größeren und herrlicheren Stoff zu wagen gedenkt. Klopstock concludes his speech by calling on German poets to prove those foreign voices wrong, especially French critics, who justifiably, in fact, continued to denigrate the quality of German literature, i.e., Klopstock himself thinks this is justified. He contends that while German authors of writings in philosophy and other disciplines have gained international recognition, there is a lamentable lack of good German poets. What is needed above all, he argues, is an illustrious German epic to restore the long-neglected honor of the fatherland and adorn Germany with fame. Ein jedes Volk von Europa wird mit dem Verfasser eines Heldengedichts prangen, und wir werden, träge und gleichsam, was dieses Gefühl der Ehre betrifft, schamlos, seiner auch als dennoch entbehren. Die Rede vom Heldengedichte, diesem höchsten Werke der Dichtkunst. Das hat von unseren Poeten noch keiner geschaffen. So this is really then the foundation of his program in writing Der Messias. Klopstock's valedictory oration was a school leaver speech given to a small circle of people, and it was not published until 1780, as I said. It did not, therefore, have any impact in theoretical terms, one might say. But it gives a comprehensive account of Klopstock's lifelong project to enter the greatest poets of all time have contended for supremacy, and it articulates his ambition to enable German poetry to compete successfully with other European literatures. This project gained publicity through the friends he made after leaving school and embarking on the study of theology at first Jena and then Leipzig. And it has to be said that none of these topoi are original. The whole point of them, in a sense, is that they are shared, that they're very much part of a joint discourse sustained by classical writers at the study of classical literature. The Bremer Beiträger were like-minded poets who published the first three cantos of Der Messias in the Bremer Beiträge in 1748, and the involvement of Johann Jakob Bodmer, Swiss antagonist of Gottsched in Leipzig, proved key for the success of the work. The cultural dimension which Klopstock foregrounds in the quoted passage was in no way new. The cultural context for the speech was a debate about the deficiencies of German language and literature that was fueled above all by French critics, and as late as 1780 it prompted a much debated intervention by the Francophile King Frederick the Great, in which he terms the German language half barbaric and unfit for writing poetry. Klopstock's reading of Milton was reliant on Bodmer's somewhat pedestrian translation into prose, which I've given you a taste of here, which Klopstock evidently encountered in 1742. This was, I think, this was a later edition. It was not the first edition. Bodmer's first version was in 1732, but 1742 version appears to be the one that Klopstock was then familiar with. Klopstock did not learn English until later on, and even then not to anything like the level of his command of Latin. His wife, Meta, was always the one who was stronger in English, is my impression. Bodmer's purpose was primarily to disseminate the great work by the English poet in German, and the impact on Klopstock is likely to have been occasioned not least by the motifs of emulatio that situate it prominently in the classical tradition and point the way for ambitious successors. Milton introduces his work with the topoi Klopstock was familiar with from his classical education. Sing, heavenly muse, I thence invoke thy aid to my adventurous song, that with no middle flight intends to soar above the Aeolian mount, while it pursues things unattempted yet in prose or rhyme. Klopstock adopts the exhortation sing as the first word in his German response to Milton's epic, and he now substitutes the Christian immortal soul, unsterbliche Seele, for Milton's muse, while recalling Milton's subject matter with the reference to man as Adams Geschlecht. I'll just read the first part, which is you may find a bit difficult to decipher here. Sing, unsterbliche Seele der sündigen Menschen Erlösung, die der Messias auf Erden in seiner Menschheit vollendet.
und durch die er Adams Geschlechte die Liebe der Gottheit mit dem Blute des heiligen Bundes von neuem geschenkt hat. Also geschah des ewigen Wille. Klopstock adopts the classical hexameter for his epic Der Messias, with which he seeks to establish German poetry among the great national traditions. But he turns to Milton's Christian model for his subject matter. While Paradise Lost ends with the banishment of Adam and Eve from the Garden of Eden, God there promises that humankind will be redeemed, a promise made good in Milton's much briefer Paradise Regained, focused on the biblical story of Jesus resisting the temptation by Satan in the desert. Klopstock, by contrast, elaborates on the redemptive act, depicting the Passion in 10 cantos, followed by 10 cantos devoted to the resurrection. Milton's binary structure and the focus on Jesus are mirrored in Klopstock's epic, with the first half being devoted to the Passion and the second half to the resurrection. Milton's beginning also looks forward already to the redemptive act of Jesus Christ. Till one greater man restore us and regain the blissful seed. Klopstock makes this act of redemption the climax of his epic, which culminates in the protagonist's ascent to heaven, accompanied by choruses of angels. While the beginning of Klopstock's epic is firmly rooted in convention, the final 20th canto is highly innovative, above all metrically. Indeed, this canto goes some way towards justifying Roger Paulin's view that the lyrical components call the designation of Der Messias as an epic into question, alongside the fact that the work collapses into episodes. He put this view forward in his paper Goethe and Klopstock, A Last Word, presented to the Society and published in 1901. I should like to contend, rather, that Klopstock here follows in the illustrious tradition of pursuing things unattempted yet, in prose or rhyme. The 20th canto consists of a wealth of 4-line meters, which Klopstock created especially for this purpose, alongside meters for ode forms. So this was a collection of lyrische Silbenmaße published in 1764, which he published as a manuscript für Freunde, which meant that it was still, it could still be a slightly experimental publication, but he then used these meters at later stages. So this is one example of one of these lyrische Silbenmaße. So I'll just read it out. So what you can see here is is these sort of a length and then 3 unstressed syllables and then a stressed syllable, which is a very unusual sequence. And what Klopstock strove to do with these meters was to make them not just metrical units that might come across rhythmically in a wide variety of ways, depending where the word boundaries fall, but to make them into Voltfüße so that they would actually rhythmically embody the pattern that you're seeing there. So in this example, ach, zu dem Triumph schweben wir empor, Engel und ihr, Erben des Lichts, kommen zu des Sohns, Himmelsgang. Heiliger Tod, seliges Entfliehen, Gräber und ihr Grauen, Wonne seid ihr, Himmel und sein Heil. And he even sort of notes proportions between long and short syllables in the margin. So this is very much kind of part of a long-standing project of working with different approaches to meter and trying out different ways of how the words of the given language connect with the patterns of the meter itself. Klopstock had already challenged his readers at earlier stages of his career with highly unfamiliar meters, both with the hexameter and with his adaptation of Horatian meters for his odes. Both were highly controversial, and the meters were published in schematic form above the odes because he couldn't rely on people otherwise being able to read them in the way that was necessary. I'll read the Wait a minute, I'm just looking for the next slide. No. You can't have to. Yes. So here you've got an example in, for instance, so weit schon über den Wolken erhob sich der Gott Versöhner. Here you've got the hexameters that connect the 20th canto with the rest of the epic. But then what follows is a 4-line stanza which consists of these Wortfüße. Fanget bebend an, atmet kaum, leisen laut, denn es ist Christus Lob. Was zu singen ihr wagt, die Ewigkeit durchströmt, tönt von Äon fort zu Äon. Klopstock here evokes a magnificent soundscape in which the meaning of the words melds with the rhythms to evoke the heavenly songs, with the image here drawing on the call of the drawing in the call of the last trumpet. Drauf erhub ein Chor Erstandener der zitternden Wonne Stimme, die Harfen rauschten mit sanftem Getön und wie fernher rufte der Donnerhall der Posaune. The metrical complexity gives added poignancy to the arrival of Jesus at the right hand of God, where he takes his seat in a line which consists of a complete hexameter in the form in which Klopstock introduced it to the German language. Jesus, der Mittler, der Allbarmherzige, war in der vollen Gottesliebe verklärt. So sah den Vater der Himmel aller Himmel. So sah den Sohn des Vaters aller Himmel Himmel. In dem betrat die Höhe des Thrones Jesus Christus und setzte sich zu der Rechte des Vaters. The effect of this would, of course, be enhanced if you had worked your way through 20,000 or so hexameters. Klopstock's epic project was written on the cusp of the modern era and intended to put German literature on the literary map. Goethe undertook to go one better with his Faust, a tragedy of epic proportions divided into 2 parts. With his choice of genre, Goethe responds to Aristotle's advocacy for tragedy, rather than the Homeric epic as the highest form of poetic literature. But this is no tragedy in the common mold. The performance of Peter Stein's Faust project in the year 2000 took 8 hours for part 1 and 14 hours for part 2. The question that arises in the present context is whether Goethe's project can sensibly be considered to be a response to Klopstock's epic. I should like to argue that there is a significant and meaningful connection, with the complexity of the connection right through to independent creation being a characteristic of Goethe's Klopstock reception, and indeed a mark of the enormously important impetus that Klopstock's ambitious Messias project provided for subsequent poets, but above all for Goethe. For what Klopstock imparted to the German poetic tradition above all, perhaps, was the courage and impetus to innovate and transform the tradition and to build this into the tradition as a legitimate response. Book 12 of Goethe's Dichtung und Wahrheit gives us some indirect glimpses of Goethe's response to Klopstock as the most prominent predecessor for young German poets of the following generation. I've put together a selection of comments, each of which merits reading against the grain, as it were. So the framing of it is with explicit reference to Klopstock, but with Klopstock as a figure who belongs to the past and is of a different kind to the generation that Goethe belongs to and celebrates here. Nun trat Klopstock hervor und bot seine Gelehrtenrepublik auf Subskription an. Obgleich die späteren Gesänge des Messias nicht die Wirkung tun konnten wie die früheren, die, selbst rein und unschuldig, in eine reine und unschuldige Zeit kamen, so blieb doch die Achtung gegen den Dichter immer gleich. So this is then an earlier time that is rein und unschuldig, very closely associated with religious values, but also with values that have very little to do with the way in which Goethe projects his own generation. he outlines the context, which was indeed very important for the dissemination of the literary endeavors and was already very important for Klopstock, as we saw with his friendship with the Bremer Beiträger and then contact with Bodmer. Eine rasche Mitteilung war unter den Literaturfreunden schon eingeleitet. Die Musenalmanache verbanden alle jungen Dichter, die Journale den Dichter mit den übrigen Schriftstellern. Meine Lust am Hervorbringen war grenzenlos. Viele nahmen gern an meinen größeren und kleinen Arbeiten teil, weil ich einen jeden, der sich nur einigermaßen zum Hervorbringen geneigt und geschickt fühlte, etwas in seiner eigenen Art unabhängig zu leisten, dringend nötigte und von allen gleichfalls wieder zu neuem Dichten und Schreiben aufgefordert wurde. So there is a sense here then of Goethe taking on a kind of leadership role, but at the same time, everybody creating entirely, as it were, independently and developing their own original talent. And we remember here the sort of focus on Natur with Homer, genius that already was part of the kind of classical series of topoi that were around us. Dieses wechselseitige, bis zur Ausschweifung gehende Hetzen und Treiben gab jedem nach seiner Art einen fröhlichen Einfluss. Und aus diesem Quirlen und Schaffen und aus diesem Leben und Leben lassen, aus diesem Nehmen und Geben, welches mit freier Brust, ohne irgendeinen theoretischen Leitstern, von so viel Jünglingen nach eines jeden angeborenen Charakter, ohne Rücksichten getrieben wurde, entsprang jene berühmte, berufene und verrufene Literarepoche, in welcher eine Masse junger, genialer Männer mit aller Mutigkeit und aller Anmaßung, wie sie nur einer solchen Jahreszeit eigen sein mag, hervorbrachen. So the terms I've here highlighted are those which sort of connect with the topoi that we were looking at earlier in relation to Klopstock, but they're now being reused and adapted to a very different context, where a new generation that consists of lots of highly energetic young men, each of whom are doing something quite original. An interesting aspect is the question of whether there was a theoretischer Leitstern. Certainly, Klopstock was in the background, whether theoretically, in practice, or as an author who had been set aside, is open to interpretation. Meredith Lee has shown with extensive close analysis of textual examples how important Klopstock's work was for Goethe's early writing, and also how complex the manifestations of an anxiety of influence were as it played out in the course of Goethe's early career. Not least in the light of this, her contention that Goethe's portrayal of Klopstock in Dichtung und Wahrheit was a generous attempt, I quote, to correct some of the more one-sided perceptions of Klopstock's poetry and also of Klopstock, end quote, is unconvincing, as is her view that Klopstock's role ceased to be significant after around 1775. I should rather like to suggest that Der Messias continued to be important for the composition of Faust. An early connection is evident in his attempt in Goethe's attempt to write in verse epic entitled Der Ewig-Weibliche in 1774, as Lee has shown with some very good analysis of the connections. It may also be significant that Goethe expands a play focused on a German protagonist and with its first part situated in a German setting for a project of epic proportions. Again, we remember the call for a national epic. Faust may be regarded as the German epic that trumps all predecessors and puts German poetic literature on the European map for all time. Goethe uses the binary structure of his tragedy for two dimensions of action. Part one in the small world of contemporary Germany, and part two in the great world encompassing world history and taking the audience into the world beyond mortal life. There's a certain parallel here with Milton's two epics, Paradise Lost and Paradise Regained, and with Klopstock's two-part epic focused on the Passion and the Resurrection. Goethe hugely expands the preliminary invocation and summary of the action that we find in the classical tradition, in Milton and in Klopstock, distributing the overview among different participants in a framing part of the work. Something stupid. Yes. So here we have the kind of preamble to the beginning of the play, a Zueignung, a Vorspiel auf dem Theater, a Prolog im Himmel. So that's what I mean then by distributing the overview among different participants, as it were, in a framing of the work. The song still features, now in form of a cantatio benevolentiae voiced by the poet in an indirect address to his unknown audience in the Zueignung, as a modest Lied, a genre designation that stands in obvious tension with the scope of the work. The Vorspiel auf dem Theater announces an action that accompanies the entirety of creation, while misleadingly suggesting that the action will culminate in hell, as the audience might expect, given the Faust tradition. This limited perspective of the theatre professionals is corrected in the Prolog im Himmel, where der Herr himself announces to Mephisto and the audience that Faust will be saved, notwithstanding his transgressions. While all these parts of the preamble reveal connections with the epic tradition, there is no reason to assume a particular connection with Klopstock. The final, in part 2, however, makes full use of the scope for innovation that Klopstock had opened up with the final canto of his epic. So we're looking here at the scene Bergflucht, Waldfels. Here, Faust's immortal remains are being transported up to ever purer spheres, moving upwards like the Virgin Mary, die Himmelskönigin, and supported by the penitent who used to be called Gretchen, who is exhorted by the Mater Gloriosa to support Faust in his newfound endeavor of spiritual purification. The sequence of heavenly choruses accompanying Faust on his last journey has a clear model in the final canto of Der Messias. The meters are varied, here with predominant alternating meters interspersed with dactyls and choriams. I've given some examples on the slide, and we'll read the introductory lines of the first Chor und Echo, which immediately draw in meters redolent of the classical tradition. Waldung, sie schwankt heran, Felsen, sie lasten dran, Wurzeln, sie klammern an, Stamm dicht an Stamm hinan. The lines by Dr. Marianus, a historically grounded figure whose academic credentials as an expert in Mariology are hinted at in classically dactylic lines. Figures and the symbolism deployed by Goethe, who himself, of course, grew up in a Protestant environment, are more akin to Catholic pageantry than to Klopstock's more abstract Protestant supernatural realms, probably not least in response to Schelling's critique of the abstraction that is characteristic of Klopstock's imagery. The poetic coda of the male-centric work, celebrating the uplifting female force previously embodied by the saintly Gretchen, tends towards simplicity, with the alternating forms typical of the German tradition and folk poetry. Gretchen's lines, Neige, neige, du ohne Gleiche, are particularly moving and they recall her prayer from part 1. In other choral sections, Goethe includes a reference to the central Christian devotional tradition in the form of references to texts from the New Testament, as in the reference here to Luke chapter 7, and subsequent retelling of the relevant episode of Jesus' life. So there's sort of something here for everyone. The final chorus mysticus, however, is distinct from the lines before and concludes the work with rhythms reminiscent of the classical tradition. Alles Vergängliche ist nur ein Gleichnis, das Unzulängliche, hier wird's Ereignis, das Unbeschreibliche, hier ist es getan, das Ewig-Weibliche zieht uns hinan. I'd now like to move on to Rilke's Duineser Elegies, which would seem to be a far cry from Klopstock's epic celebration of the passion and resurrection of the Messiah, but also a far cry from this one. Yet Rilke engaged closely with Klopstock's Messias when writing his Duineser Elegies, and explicitly acknowledged his admiration for the work as well as working closely with Klopstock's poetry, especially when composing a number of poems on religious themes during this period. Friedrich Wilhelm Wottke's doctoral dissertation of 1948, entitled Rilke and Klopstock, has convincingly demonstrated the extent of the work that Rilke did with Klopstocks. The third and final book of Rilke's, Das Stundenbuch, published in 1905, indeed features the poet announcing his project of being der Mund der neuen Messiade. We'll read the poem. Das letzte Zeichen lass an uns geschehen. Erfülle, du gewaltiger Gewährer, nicht jenen Traum der Gottgebärerin, richt auf den Wichtigen, den Todgebärer, und führ uns mitten durch die Hände derer, die ihn verfolgen werden, zu ihm hin. Du aber gründe ihn in deine Gnade, in deinem alten Glanze pflanz ihn ein, und mich lass Tänzer dieser Bundeslade, lass mich den Mund der neuen Messiade, den Tönenden, den Täufer sein. So he situates his work very firmly in the religious tradition. This prominent accolade and inclusion of the Messiade as the sort of key concept of the project that the poet wishes to pursue, unequivocally establishes Klopstock's importance for Rilke's sense of identity as a poet in his early work, especially in this religious context. And it is, of course, particularly significant because the statement focuses on the voice of the poet. I've also included a report here from that Klopstock sends to Katharina Kippenberg, in which he gives an insight into the inspiring impact Klopstock had on him, with poetry that lent itself to powerful vocalization. Indeed, attendees of the readings he gave of the Duineser Elegies were hugely impressed by the power of his voice and the emotive effect on the audience. This impact matches that generated in the 18th century by readers of Klopstock's Messias. I'll read that passage. Vielleicht erinnern Sie sich, wie es immer schon mein Wunsch war, den Messias zu besitzen. In Toledo noch meinte ich manchmal, ich würde ihn draußen laut gelesen haben in der Wildnis, in die die nächste Landschaft rings um die Stadt unbändig ausbricht. Es ging mir nach. Hierher zurückgekehrt, erneute ich bei meinen mehreren Antiquaren meine verjährten Anfragen und erhalte nun eben vor einer Stunde 2 schöne alte Lederbände zu dem geringsten Preis. Der Messias, Altona 1780. This is a key addition. Rilke wrote this letter soon after beginning his Duineser Elegies in a process of composition which lasted some 10 years, but from the start included the beginnings of the final elegy, as he reports to Marie von Tourne-Taxis in the context of announcing the successful conclusion of the work. Endlich, Fürstin, endlich der gesegnete wie gesegnete Tag, da ich Ihnen den Abschluss, soweit ich sehe, der Elegien anzeigen kann. 10. Von der letzten großen, zu dem in Duino einst begonnenen Anfang, dass ich dereinst am Ausgang der grimmigen Einsicht Jubel und Ruhm aufsinge zustimmenden Engeln. Von dieser letzten, die ja auch damals schon gemeint war, die letzte zu sein. Von dieser zittert mir noch die Hand. Eben Samstag, den 11. um 6 Uhr abends, ist sie fertig. Alles in ein paar Tagen. Es war ein namenloser Sturm, ein Orkan im Geist, wie damals auf Duino. Alles, was Faser in mir ist und Geweb, hat gekracht. The speaker at the start of the first elegy, however, contrasts starkly with the voice evoked by Klopstock at the start of his epic. Instead of the empowering exaltation, sing unsterbliche Seele, that creates the vocalization in the process of calling for it, Rilke's poet evokes a cry or scream while leaving it in the realm of hypothesis. The poet's experience is that of remaining unheard, even if he cried out, and of being overpowered, even if he were heard. The realm of the sublime, which meets with assumed resonance in Klopstock's epic, here remains ineffectual and a source of terror. elegy returns to the question posed in the first elegy and conveys a resolution, which the poet finds in his own approach to those aspects of the human condition that entail pain and suffering and that demand a modification of values. Natural imagery here comes to the fore as a means of valuing all parts of the natural cycle that forms the basis of the human condition. The 10th elegy offers a mythical exploration of death through the prism of a youth guided by a personified Klage through a mythical landscape. By contrast with the celebratory upward movement at the end of Klopstock's and Goethe's works, his youth moves on a horizontal plane and merges into a landscape of silent hills. Rilke, like Goethe, concludes his magnum opus with a brief poetic coda, but his concluding message is poignantly modest, embodied by the falling catkin. Let's call that the contrast, as it were, between the first and the 10th elegy. So the first elegy, wer, wenn ich schrie, hörte mich denn aus der Engel Ordnungen? Und gesetzt selbst, es nähme einer mich plötzlich ans Herz, ich verginge von seinem stärkeren Dasein. Denn das Schöne ist nichts als des schrecklichen Anfang, den wir noch gerade ertragen. Und wir bewundern es so, weil es gelassen verschmäht, uns zu zerstören. Ein jeder Engel ist schrecklich. So this is very much the realm of the sublime. And in the 10th elegy then, dass ich dereinst an dem Ausgang der grimmigen Einsicht Jubel und Ruhm auf Singe zustimmenden Engeln, dass von den klar geschlagenen Hämmern des Herzens keiner versage an weichen, zweifelnden oder reißenden Seiten, dass mich mein strömendes Antlitz glänzender mache, dass das unscheinbare Weinen blühe, dass ich euch Kniender nicht, untröstliche Schwestern, hinnahm, nicht in euer gelöstes Haar mich gelöster ergab. Wir Vergeuder der Schmerzen, wie wir sie absehen voraus in die traurige Dauer, ob sie nicht enden vielleicht. Sie aber sind ja unser winterbäriges Laub, unser dunkles Sinnengrün, eine der Zeiten des heimlichen Jahres, nicht nur Zeit, sind Stelle, Siedelung, Lager, Boden, Wohnort. The 10th elegy offers a mythical exploration of death through the prism of a youth guided by a personified Klage through a mythical landscape, with kind of sort of overtones of a love relationship that is not developed. By contrast with the celebratory upward movement at the end of Klopstock's and Goethe's works, the youth then moves on a horizontal plane and becomes, as it were, part of the landscape. On his journey, he passes through the Leitstadt initially, where Rilke offers a kind of sort of critique of modernity, with all its detritus and meaningless, as it were, details that are distractions, and with a number of metaphors that go far beyond anything that, in terms of, as it were, triviality, but at the same time capturing that triviality without becoming trivial themselves, that moves in a very different direction to anything that Klopstock or Goethe do. So freilich wehe, wie fremd sind die Gassen der Leitstadt, wo in der falschen, aus Übertönung gemachten Stille stark aus der Gussform des Leeren der Ausguss prahlt. Der vergoldete Lärm, das platzende Denkmal, oh wie spurlos zerträte ein Engel ihnen den Trostmarkt, den die Kirche begrenzt, ihre fertig gekaufte. Reichlich und zu und enttäuscht wie ein Postamt am Sonntag. Oh, aber gleich darüber hinaus, hinter der letzten Planke, beklebt mit Plakaten des Todlos, jenes bitteren Biers, das den Trinkenden süß scheint, wenn sie immer dazu frische Zerstreuungen kauen, gleich im Rücken der Planke, gleich dahinter ist's wirklich. At this point, then, we move into this mythical landscape of the Klage. And I will go only to the sort of last part of this. Einsam steigt dahin in die Berge des Urleids, und nicht einmal sein Schritt klingt aus dem tonlosen Los. Aber erweckten sie uns, die unendlich Toten, ein Gleichnis. Siehe, sie zeigten vielleicht auf die Kätzchen der leeren Hasel, die hängenden, oder meinten den Regen, der fällt auf dunkles Erdreich im Frühjahr. Und wir, die an steigendes Glück denken, empfänden die Rührung, die uns beinahe bestürzt, wenn ein glückliches fällt. So here, I think, have a very different conclusion to the project, to anything we find in Klopstock or Goethe, but it gains meaning really from that grandeur of the upward movement that here culminates in a downward movement, which is deeply meaningful, and where we're invited to find the meaning that will enable us to, as it were, find metaphysical meaning in a modern world where the older certainties have disintegrated and are no longer available in the same way that they were to Klopstock and Goethe. But it seems to me that there is a dialogue there that's going on that is fruitful both for the poets or the younger poet and also the audience, because there is a sense then of an ongoing tradition which is sustaining those different myths in such a way that they can be recalled, modified, and given new meaning for new audiences. So I'll stop there.